Hi, it's Nicole. Today's reading journal entry is a 18th century novel, Evelina, or the history of a young lady's entrance into the world. Why did I decide to read Evelina? Some people say it's a brilliant novel in its own right, but I read it because the author, Frances Burney, was Jane Austen's favorite novelist. I will read a little bit from this excellent Jane Austen biography. It says, another novelist among the friends of the family was Jane's favourite, Frances Burney, who had written Evelina and Cecilia, and who now was publishing her novel Camilla by subscription. A bit like crowdfunding today, subscribers got the privilege of having their names listed in the front of the finished book. The list for Camilla reads rather like a sisterhood of Georgian female novelists, because so many of them supported their fellow author. It includes a Mrs. Radcliffe, a Miss Edgeworth, and indeed a 19-year-old Miss Jane Austen of Stevenson, whose guinea must have been paid for her by her father. Evelina was Frances Burney's first novel. It was published in 1778, and broadly speaking, it comes under the same category as Jane Austen's stories, I'd say. It's a 18th century social satire with a love story in the genteel society, and it's an epistolary novel, which means the whole story is told via a series of letters. There are many similarities between Evelina and some elements in Jane Austen's stories. We'll talk about that a bit later on. But first of all, what is Evelina about? So at the beginning of the story, Evelina was 17 years old. She grew up as an orphan. Her mother died a long time ago and her father was not around. So she was raised by this country clergyman called Arthur Villiers. She had good education, but she has never seen the world. She had seen very little of the world. So at the beginning, she went to visit and stayed with Lady Howard, a friend of Arthur Villiers. So she ended up in London with Lady Howard's family, the Mervyns. She's never been to London and she was super excited to go to all the theatres, all the balls, all the operas. But because she's never been, she didn't know how to behave. She didn't know what was the right way to interact with people and all of these conventions and social behaviours. So she made some humiliating mistakes, but also at this ball, she met a few men. One of them was Lord Orville. When she was in London, she met her grandmother, her mother's mother, Madame Duval, by chance. And Madame Duval just came from France to London and wished to take Evelina home to France with her because she had somehow never heard of Evelina's existence until recently. And now she found out there's a granddaughter. She wished to take her back to France to live with her because now she was her closest blood relation. So Evelina was forced to live with Madame Duval and her relations, her new family members, the Brunton cousins. While she was living with them, she rescued a Mr. McCartney from committing suicide and from some financial difficulties. But apart from this Mr. McCartney, everybody was horrible and really unpleasant to live with. So she was super ashamed of her new family relations, especially she doesn't want to be seen with them by Lord Orville. But there was one fatal day. She was seen by Lord Orville by chance with her family, but also with some shockingly inappropriate company. So she was mortified. So after meeting all of these mostly unpleasant people and all of these unpleasant experiences in London, she moved on to Bristol, where she finally got to spend some time with Lord Orville in this house in private to develop their romantic relationship. So the last part of the story also deals with her parentage and how she found out about her father and how they reconciled with each other. And it has a happy ending. So in what ways does Evelina remind me of Jane Austen stories and in what ways are they different? So Evelina, one thing comes across most strongly is that she is a solitary heroine. A few weeks ago, in my previous video, we talked about C.S. Lewis's view on Jane Austen's novels, and we saw how he categorized Jane Austen's 6 novels into 2 groups, and one of them is the solitary heroine. And if you are familiar with the stories, they are Fanny Price and Anne Elliot. So Evelina is very similar to Fanny Price and Anne Elliot in the sense that she is alone a lot of the time. She's not physically alone, she's with people all the time, but she's alone in the sense that she hasn't got friends. As we mentioned earlier, the novel is told through a series of letters, and most of them are written by Evelina to this father figure at home, to Arthur Villas. So she has him as a father figure, and he gives her advice from a distance, but because he is so far away, he can't be there a lot of the time. Well, most of the time he's not there at all. And also at the beginning of the story, Evelina made this friend called Maria. They are similar age and they are good friends. Maria is part of Lady Howard's family. So like a young lady from a genteel family. But when Evelina needs her a lot of the time in London or in a social situation, there's no advice from her either. She's absent. Maria is absent in a lot of the action. She wasn't helping much either. So in that sense, Evelina is a solitary heroine and she's alone. But let's compare her to Anne Elliot and Fanny Price a bit more. Evelina is a lot less a observer and a lot less a outsider compared to Fanny Price. She's involved in a lot of the conversations, a lot of the actions, purely because she's too beautiful to be left alone. That's another thing. She is beautiful to the extreme. She's an angel. Every single man in the story who meets her falls in love with her, and it gets quite repetitive after a while. But unfortunately, all of the men, apart from one, are quite trashy men. All of them seem to have this urge to grab her. It's very funny. They all try to take hold of her hands or take hold of her physically, and it gets a bit uncomfortable after a while. But yeah, that's what happens. So against her will, she's forced into conversations and actions all the time, so she's more involved. But compared to Anne Elliot, she's a lot less mature and a lot less intelligent. Evelina gets pressured to do things she promised not to do, got pressured into going to places she shouldn't go, and ends up in situations against her will all the time. And she even tells lies knowingly because she has no choice. So there's another similarity, which is between Evelina and Lizzie Bennet. Evelina was raised in a genteel family to be a lady, but she has some very humiliating and very embarrassing family members, just like Lizzie Bennet and her mother. So Evelina is constantly mortified and thinks Lord Orville would never love her, would never marry her, because he would never want to associate with a family like hers. One contrast is that Frances Burney doesn't talk about money and yearly income as much as Jane Austen does in her stories. So that makes me think Evelina actually is not very poor, or the fact that she's poor is not emphasized, apart from only one section of the story when she lives under the same roof as Lord Orville and his sister, who are proper lords and ladies. Obviously they are a lot more wealthy, so she was ignored a little bit then because she was nobody. But apart from that, she wasn't desperately trying to get married because that was the sole solution for her future and her independence. So this father figure in the country, this clergyman, also constantly saying Evelina is going to have all his fortune when he dies. So that's one contrast. Another big contrast is that Frances Burney's characters, some of them, are a lot more brutal than anybody could have been in Jane Austen stories. In Norton Anthology, that one, I'll read you a little bit about their comments on Frances Burney. He says, although her writing crackles with humour, it can be relentless and sometimes cruel in exposing bad manners or a selfish heart. I'll try to give you an example. Captain Mervyn, which is the head of the Mervyn family, Maria's father, he really dislikes Madame Duval, this French woman, which is, yeah, to be fair, not a very pleasant person to live with. But he played a practical joke on her that ended up not very funny at all. It's not very good taste. He performed this fake highway robbery while Madame Duval and Evelina were traveling in the countryside, I think, in a carriage. So they plotted with the servants and they robbed Madame Duval and dragged her out of the carriage and tied her up onto a tree, I think, in the middle of nowhere, in a ditch. And she got completely muddy, completely wet from head to foot. And the Captain Mervyn had great fun doing that. And it was like a triumph for him. He revenged on some small grudges he had with Madame Duval. I just thought that was quite shocking. Probably we're just used to Jane Austen's style. I find Frances Burney's practical jokes is a bit hard to take. And there's another example towards the end of the story where I expect the climax of the story to be. I expect to read about how Evelina and Lord Orville came together and got married, and how she reconciled with her father, and a happy ending. But in there's a very absurd, very bizarre scene of Captain Mervyn plays another practical joke on another person, which is really cruel. It would never have appeared in a Jane Austen novel. Hello, this is Editing Nicole. Want to add a few lines. Evelina was called the chick lit novel of 1778 by Times on the audiobook cover. It's definitely very dramatic, very sensational. The humiliation of the heroine, the romantic relationship, the vulnerable, helpless, gullible, but very beautiful young woman with a pack of scandalous men. I'm sure it was very thrilling. I think it gives us a historical context. What were novels like around Jane Austen's time? Evelina was popular about 20 years before Pride and Prejudice was published. For today, this is 2022, the equivalent will be something like a novel very, very popular that was published in 2000, so it's still very contemporary. It would be something like Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire that was published in 2000. So today, if I want to write a story about a witch and a wizard, go to a magic school and have to fight against a Dark Lord, there's no way I would not be influenced by Harry Potter, knowing how much I love Harry Potter. So I think that might be a similar situation for Jane Austen. But how much was she influenced? How much was she inspired? We know that she published 6 novels. There are 3 unpublished or unfinished novels. So there's Lady Susan, The Watsons, and Sanditon. So out of the 9, the only truly horrible person is Lady Susan. This was one of her very early novels. According to this one, it says Lady Susan may have been written as early as 1794, when Austen was 18 or 19, soon after the last of the teenage writings and not long before a first draft of Eleanor and Marianne. That one became Sense and Sensibility and was published in 1811. So in a very, very early novel, she created this character called Lady Susan. She is the same kind of explicit, undisguised, horrible person like some of the characters in Evelina. And also Lady Susan was an epistolary novel as well, so that's a similarity. There's also things like in Evelina, there's a guy called Willoughby. He reads very similar to Marianne's Willoughby. And there is a character in Evelina called Lady Louisa Larpent. She's Lord Orville's sister, and she reads very similar to Caroline Binley. And there's a scene in Northumberland Abbey. Catherine Morland went out with some man against her will and missed spending time with another man who she'd much rather spend time with. So she went out and came back. The person called and she missed him. There's a very similar scene in Evelina. But I'd say Jane Austen borrowed those ideas, those characters, or those scenes and made them much better. Jane Austen's novels are just more subtle and more elegant, I'd say. Evelina is a innocent but a very boring person, I'd say, to spend time with, unless you count watching her struggle every step of the way as fun. But Lizzie Bennet, Anne Elliot, and the Dashwood sisters had a lot more depth to their character and their stories. Just before I go, I want to read you another little paragraph from a different essay. Apparently, the story of Evelina was inspired by Frances Burney's half-sister. From this collection, Genius and Ink, by Virginia Woolf, there's an essay called Fanny Burney's Half-Sister. He says, since a copy of Evelina was lately sold for the enormous sum of £4,000, since the Clarendon Press has lately bestowed the magnificent compliment of a new edition upon Evelina, since Maria Allen was the half-sister of the authoress of Evelina, since the story of Evelina owed much to the story of Maria Allen, it may not be impertinent to consider what is still to be collected of the history of that misguided and unfortunate girl. And the rest of the essay talks about briefly the life of Maria Allen and her relationship with the Burneys, and how she kind of eloped to France and got married and her life. But as far as I can tell, I don't really see any resemblance between Evelina and Maria Allen at all. I'm probably just missing something. That's all for today. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in my next one. Bye.